long before marble stadiums echoed with footsteps, long before olive wreaths rested on tired brows. There was a quieter question lingering in the ancient world, one that few dared to speak aloud, but everyone seemed to feel. Why did people stop fighting, even briefly, to run, wrestle, and race beneath an open sky? Why did entire cities agree to lay down weapons simply to watch bodies move through dust and sunlight? The answer was never simple, and perhaps that is why it has survived for so long, drifting through time like a half-remembered dream. Imagine a land where the earth itself felt alive and unpredictable. Mountains rose sharply from the ground. Seas could turn violent without warning, and the sun ruled the rhythm of every day. In this world, nothing felt guaranteed. Crops could fail, storms could erase years of work, and illness arrived without explanation. To the people living there, these were not accidents of nature. They were messages, warnings, signs that something unseen was watching. In such a world, every action carried weight. Every ritual mattered. Humans did not believe they stood alone at the center of existence. Instead, they lived beneath towering forces they could not control, only respect, fear, and attempt to understand. The gods were not distant or abstract ideas. They were present in thunder, in victory, in sudden loss. And when people gathered, it was never just for themselves. It was always, in some quiet way, for the gods as well. This is where the idea of the games begins, not as sport, not as entertainment, but as a question asked through movement. What if strength could be an offering? What if speed could be a prayer? What if discipline, endurance, and pain could speak more clearly than words ever could? In the beginning, no one knew the answers. They only knew the need to try. Picture a clearing under the open sky. No grand structures yet. No crowds roaring in unison. Just people standing together, uncertain but attentive. The air is warm, the ground uneven beneath bare feet. Somewhere nearby, an altar smolders faintly, carrying the scent of burnt offerings. Silence falls, not because someone demands it, but because everyone feels it should be there. Something important is about to happen, though no one can fully explain why. A man steps forward to run, not to win applause, but to prove something to himself, to his community, to the gods who may be watching. His breath grows heavy, muscles tightening, heart pounding like a drum echoing inside his chest. As he moves, others watch closely, not judging skill alone, but searching for meaning. Was his stride strong? Was his effort honest? Did the gods approve? In moments like these, competition was not about defeating another person. It was about testing the limits of what it meant to be human in a world governed by forces far greater than any individual. Pain was not avoided. It was embraced as proof of devotion. Exhaustion was not failure. It was evidence that one had given everything. Over time, these moments repeated themselves. Not exactly the same, but close enough to feel familiar. People remembered. They told stories. They returned to the same places, year after year, drawn by something deeper than tradition. Each gathering carried echoes of the last, like footsteps layering over older footprints in the dust. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the question evolved. It was no longer just why people competed, but why they returned. Why did these moments of shared struggle feel necessary? Why did watching another person push themselves to the edge stir something deep and quiet inside the soul? Perhaps it was because, in watching others strive, people were reminded that life itself was a kind of contest, not against one another, but against time, fate, and uncertainty. Each race mirrored the passage of a lifetime. Each contest reflected the fragile balance between effort and outcome. Sometimes the strongest prevailed. Sometimes they fell. And sometimes the outcome felt beyond human control, reinforcing the belief that the gods still held the final say. As the years passed, memory began to shape expectation. Certain days felt heavier, with meaning. Certain places felt charged, as if the earth itself remembered what had happened there before. People began to prepare in advance, not just physically, but spiritually. They fasted, prayed, trained, and reflected. The gathering was no longer spontaneous. It was anticipated. Yet even as patterns formed, the mystery never fully faded. No one truly knew which act would please the gods or which might provoke their anger. This uncertainty gave the gatherings their power. They were not comfortable events. They were solemn, hopeful, and tense all at once. In the quiet moments before a contest began, when the crowd stood still and the wind moved gently through olive trees, there was often a shared feeling, an unspoken awareness that something larger was unfolding. For a brief time, ordinary life paused. The noise of conflict, the burden of survival, the divisions between cities all softened at the edges. It was here in these fragile pauses that the games found their true purpose, not as a celebration of perfection, but as a reminder of limits, not as a guarantee of favor, but as an offering made without certainty of reward. The act of gathering itself became sacred, a statement that despite fear and division, people could still stand together beneath the same sky. This question, why the games began, was never meant to be answered once and forgotten. It lingered, repeating itself every time someone trained in silence, every time a crowd held its breath, every time a victor stood quietly, crowned not with gold, but with leaves taken from the living earth. And as the centuries unfolded, that question continued to echo, carried forward not just by stone ruins and ancient texts, but by something deeper and harder to name, a human instinct to find meaning through movement, to seek order within chaos, to believe, even briefly, that effort mattered, that devotion could be seen, and that somewhere beyond a visible world, someone or something was watching. The games were never just about who ran fastest or fought hardest. They were born from a longing that has never truly faded, a longing to be noticed, to be remembered, to feel, if only for a moment, that existence itself had a purpose woven into it, waiting to be revealed under the open sky. Before there were names carved into stone or stories passed carefully from one generation to the next, life in ancient Greece moved to a slower, more uncertain rhythm. Each day unfolded beneath a sky that felt vast and watchful, as though it held its breath, waiting to see what humans would attempt next. People did not wake with a sense of ownership over the land they lived on. Instead, they belonged to it, shaped by its hills and valleys, its harsh summers and unpredictable winters. Villages clung to fertile pockets of earth, separated by mountains that made travel difficult, and seas that could turn treacherous without warning. To move from one place to another was never a casual decision. It required preparation, courage, and a quiet acceptance that one might not return. Because of this, communities grew inward, bound tightly by shared labor, shared fears, and shared stories. Trust was earned slowly, and strangers were met with caution. Survival depended on cooperation, but also on respect for forces no one could control. The ground had to be worked carefully. Rain was welcome, but never assumed. The sun brought life, yet too much it could scorch fields and bodies alike. When disaster struck, it rarely came with an explanation. Crops failed. Storms destroyed homes. Illness swept through households, sparing some while taking others without warning. In the absence of clear answers, people turned to meaning. They believed the world was not random, that every event carried intention. Thunder was not just sound, it was a voice. A sudden victory in battle was not merely skill, it was favor. Loss was not always failure. Sometimes it was punishment or a test yet to be understood. Life became a constant conversation with unseen powers, even if humans could only guess at the language being spoken. This belief shaped everything. Work was not just labor, but devotion. Meals were not just nourishment, but offerings shared with the divine. Even rest held significance, as moments of stillness allowed space for reflection and prayer. The line between the ordinary and the sacred was thin, often invisible. A simple action, performed with intention, could take on immense meaning. Conflict was equally unavoidable. Scarcity bred competition, and competition led to violence. City-states rose and fell, alliances shifted, and war became a familiar presence. Yet even amid constant tension, there existed an unspoken understanding that unchecked chaos threatened everyone. If violence consumed everything, there would be nothing left to protect. It was within this fragile balance that early Greek society began to search for order, not through written laws at first, but through shared customs and rituals. These rituals offered something rare: predictability. They marked time, gave structure to uncertainty, and allowed people to believe that by repeating certain actions, they could influence outcomes. Stories played a crucial role in this process. Myths explained what logic could not. They offered reasons for suffering and models for behavior. Heroes endured hardship, defied odds, and sometimes paid the price for arrogance. Gods rewarded humility and punished excess. These stories were not distant fantasies. They were mirrors reflecting how people understood their own lives. Children grew up hearing these tales by firelight, absorbing lessons long before they could articulate them. They learned that strength mattered, but so did restraint. That courage was admired, but pride could destroy. That fate could be challenged, but never fully escaped. These ideas settled quietly into collective mind, shaping values without needing to be enforced. As populations grew and interactions between communities increased, gatherings became more important. Trade brought people together, but so did festivals, funerals, and shared religious observances. These moments allowed for brief relief from isolation, a chance to reconnect with a broader sense of identity beyond one's immediate surroundings. Still, these gatherings carried tension. Old rivalries did not disappear simply because people stood side by side. Trust was fragile, and the potential for conflict always lingered beneath polite exchanges. What was needed was something that could unite without erasing difference, something that allowed competition without bloodshed. Physical ability naturally took on symbolic importance. The body was the most immediate tool a person possessed. It was shaped by labor, disciplined by necessity, and tested by hardship. To display control over one's body was to demonstrate mastery over at least a small part of an unpredictable world. Strength, speed, and endurance became signs not just of health, but of favor and discipline. Watching someone push their body to its limits stirred deep reactions. It reminded others of their own struggles, their own efforts to endure. In a society where survival demanded constant exertion, physical excellence felt meaningful in a way that words could not fully express. It suggested balance, harmony, and the possibility that effort could align with the will of the gods. Yet admiration was always tempered by caution. Excessive pride was dangerous. Those who displayed skill too boldly risked attracting envy, both human and divine. The challenge was not just to be strong, but to be measured, not just to win, but to win correctly, honoring both community and belief. Gradually, informal tests of ability began to appear within ritual contexts. They were not announced as competitions in the modern sense. They were offerings, demonstrations, moments of shared focus. People gathered not to cheer wildly, but to witness, to observe, to interpret. In these early moments, the emphasis was less on outcome and more on conduct. How did a person carry themselves? Did they show respect? Did they endure pain without complaint? These qualities mattered deeply in a world where character was believed to shape destiny. What emerged from this environment was not inevitable, but it was natural. A society steeped in ritual, bound by myth, and shaped by constant uncertainty found meaning in structured physical challenge. It offered a rare combination of order and risk, effort and humility. As days turned into seasons and seasons into years, these early expressions of physical ritual settled quietly into tradition. No one stood back and declared beginning. There was no moment when everything changed. Instead, meaning accumulated slowly, like layers of dust on stone, until what had once been simple gatherings carried the weight of something far greater. The world of ancient Greece before the games was not waiting for entertainment. It was searching for reassurance, for signs that life, despite its unpredictability, followed patterns that could be honored and repeated. In that search, the foundations were laid for something enduring, something that would outlast the fears that gave it birth. And though those early people could not have known it, their quiet attempts to find balance between chaos and order would echo across centuries, shaping a tradition that began not with celebration, but with survival itself. There are places in the world where silence feels heavier, where the air seems to carry memory even when no one is there to speak it aloud. In ancient Greece, certain stretches of land inspire that feeling naturally, without explanation. People did not choose these places because they were convenient or beautiful in an obvious way. They chose them because something about the ground itself felt different, as if it had already been claimed by forces beyond human reach. The land that would one day cradle the games was such a place. Long before voices gathered there, before footsteps wore paths into the earth, it existed as a quiet threshold between the human and the divine. Surrounded by rolling hills and watched over by distant mountains, it was neither a city nor a wilderness, but something suspended between both. Travelers felt it as they approached, an unspoken awareness that ordinary behavior no longer applied. In the ancient mind, sacred ground was not created by walls or markers. It revealed itself through signs. A spring that never ran dry, a grove where trees seemed untouched by time, a clearing where storms passed gently while surrounding land suffered. These features were interpreted not as coincidence, but as invitation. The gods, it was believed, had already chosen these places. Humans merely responded. When early worshippers arrived, they did not come with grand plans. They brought offerings, questions, and humility. A small altar might be built, stone stacked carefully, not to dominate the space but to acknowledge it. Smoke from sacrifices rose slowly, blending with the air rather than cutting through it. The act was less about display and more about alignment, about standing in the right place and hoping to be seen. What mattered most was not permanence, but continuity. People returned again and again, often guided by stories rather than maps. They remembered how the land felt, how sound carried, how light shifted across the ground at certain times of day. Memory anchored the sacred as much as ritual did. As generations passed, these memories layered upon one another. A father would bring his son, repeating gestures learned from his own youth. A traveler would pause, sensing familiarity even if he had never been there before. Over time, the place became more than a location. It became a presence. This presence shaped behavior. Voices softened naturally. Movement slowed. Even those skeptical of divine influence felt compelled to act with care. In such spaces, arrogance fell out of place, almost dangerous. The land demanded respect without ever asking for it. When physical contests began to occur here, they did so quietly, without fanfare. A run across the open ground, a test of strength near the altar. These acts were not performed to entertain others, but to honor the space itself. Movement became a form of communication, a way of showing devotion through effort. The location mattered deeply. To struggle, sweat, and endure upon sacred ground was to place one's body in conversation with the gods. The earth beneath bare feet was believed to listen. The sky above was believed to witness. Nothing felt wasted or unseen. Unlike cities, which grew noisy and crowded, this place resisted excess. There were no permanent dwellings at first, no markets, no walls. People arrived, stayed briefly, and left, allowing the land to return to stillness. This rhythm preserved the sense that what happened there was temporary, intentional, and meaningful. Over time, the site began to draw people from farther away, not because it promised reward, but because it offered something rarer, clarity. In a fragmented world of rival cities and constant uncertainty, this place felt neutral, held apart from ordinary disputes. It belonged to no one, and therefore to everyone. This neutrality was essential. It allowed enemies to stand side by side without immediately reaching for weapons. It allowed competition without conquest. Within the boundaries of the sacred, conflict was transformed into something symbolic rather than destructive. Priests and caretakers eventually emerged, not as rulers, but as guardians. Their role was not to control the land, but to preserve its balance. They watched for signs of divine displeasure, maintained rituals, and ensured that no one violated the unspoken rules of the space. Their authority came not from force, but from trust. Stone structures appeared gradually, shaped by function rather than ambition. A temple here, a path there. Each addition respected what already existed. Nothing overwhelmed the landscape. The goal was harmony, not dominance. As the place grew in importance, so did its stories. Tales circulated of miraculous signs, of prayers answered, of omens revealed. Some stories contradicted others, but accuracy mattered less than impact. What mattered was belief. The land was alive with meaning, because people treated it as such. For athletes, arriving at the sacred ground was both an honor and a burden. The journey itself was a test, long and uncertain. Upon arrival, they were expected to cleanse themselves, not just physically, but spiritually. Impurity was not merely dirt or illness. It was imbalance. One had to be aligned with the purpose of the place. Standing there, surrounded by quiet anticipation, competitors felt the weight of those who had stood there before. Past efforts lingered like shadows, reminders that no one arrived alone. Every step was layered over countless others, each one an echo of devotion. Spectators, too, sensed this depth. They did not come simply to watch bodies move. They came to witness an unfolding tradition, to feel part of something older and larger than themselves. Applause existed, but reverence came first. In this sacred setting, time behaved differently. Days were marked by ritual rather than urgency. Moments stretched. A single contest could feel eternal, not because it lasted long, but because of the attention it demanded. Silence between events felt as meaningful as the events themselves. This place taught people how to gather, how to compete without destroying one another, how to honor effort without worshiping dominance. It provided a model for coexistence in a world that often seemed determined to fracture. Long after the voices faded and the dust settled, the land remained. It absorbed triumph and disappointment alike, holding them without judgment. Even when the games were not being held, the ground retained its quiet authority, waiting patiently for the next gathering. The birth of the sacred ground was not an accident, nor was it the result of careful planning. It emerged from intuition, belief, and repetition. It was shaped by human need and divine imagination working together. And in its stillness, it offered something profound. A reminder that meaning does not always require explanation, that some places exist to be felt rather than understood, and that when humans come together with humility, even simple acts can become timeless. Every ancient tradition carries with a fog of stories, drifting between memory and imagination, and the early games were no exception. When people tried to explain how these gatherings began, they rarely agreed on a single origin. Instead, they told many stories, each shaped by belief, region, and the quiet need to connect the present to something heroic and timeless. In ancient Greece, truth was not always singular. It was layered, symbolic, and often emotional rather than precise. One story spoke of a great god who ruled the sky, whose voice thundered across mountains, and whose will shape the fate of mortals. According to this telling, the games were born as an act of gratitude and reverence, a celebration of divine order restored after chaos. The contests were meant to honor power restrained by wisdom, strength guided by balance. In this version, every race and struggle echoed a cosmic victory, reminding humans of their place beneath a watchful, commanding presence. Another story shifted the focus from gods to heroes, from immortality to human suffering and endurance. It told of a young man bound by an impossible challenge, forced to race against time and fate itself. Through cleverness, sacrifice, and loss, he emerged victorious, yet forever marked by what it cost him. In his honor, it was said, the games were established not as joyful celebration, but as remembrance. Each contest became a quiet tribute to resilience and the fragile line between triumph and tragedy. There were also stories darker in tone, tales where blood and betrayal lingered just beneath the surface. Some claimed the games were born from funerary rites, contests held to honor the dead. Strength and speed were displayed not for glory, but as offerings to those who could no longer compete. In these tellings, the games were not hopeful beginnings, but acts of mourning transformed into tradition. Life moved forward, but it did so carrying the weight of loss. What is striking about these myths is not their contradictions, but their shared themes. All of them tied competition to something larger than individual desire. Whether honoring gods, heroes, or the dead, the act of striving was never empty. It was charged with meaning, layered with obligation and memory. For the people who told these stories, choosing one version over another was unnecessary. Each myth served a purpose, offering a lens through which to understand the same ritual from different angles. In one moment, the games could be divine celebration. In another, they could be solemn remembrance. Both could be true, depending on what the listener needed to hear. These myths were not recited as dry explanations. They were performed, spoken aloud with pauses, gestures, and knowing glances. Listeners leaned closer as familiar names and events unfolded, not because they expected new information, but because repetition itself held comfort. Hearing the story again reinforced belonging. It reminded people that they were part of an ongoing narrative, stretching backward into legend. Children absorbed these myths long before they understood their deeper meanings. To them, heroes ran faster than fear. Gods intervened dramatically, and justice, though delayed, always arrived. As they grew older, the stories grew with them, revealing layers of complexity and ambiguity. Victory was rarely clean. Favor could turn suddenly. Even the divine could be unpredictable. In this way, myths prepared people emotionally for the games themselves. Competition was never guaranteed to be fair. Strength did not always ensure success. Outcomes were influenced by forces beyond training and effort. The stories had already taught this lesson gently and repeatedly. The myths also helped explain why suffering was permitted, even required. Pain, exhaustion, and risk were not flaws of the games. They were essential elements. To struggle was to mirror the trials of heroes. To endure was to align oneself with legendary examples. When an athlete faltered, the myths softened the blow. Failure was not disgrace. It was part of a much older pattern. Storytelling also allowed communities to claim ownership of the tradition without conflict. Different regions emphasized different origins, weaving local heroes and beliefs into broader narrative. This flexibility strengthened the games rather than weakening them. They became inclusive, adaptable, capable of carrying many meanings at once. Over time, myth and ritual fed each other. The stories influenced how the games were conducted, and the games, in turn, shaped how the stories were told. A dramatic contest might inspire new details in a familiar legend. An unexpected outcome could be interpreted as divine commentary, quickly folded into mythic explanation. Even the physical landscape became entangled with storytelling. Certain landmarks were pointed out as proof: a hill where a hero once stood, a path where a race was first run. Whether these claims were historically accurate mattered little. What mattered was that belief anchored story to place, making the abstract feel tangible. As centuries passed, some versions of the myths grew more polished, others faded quietly. New interpretations emerged, shaped by changing values and political needs. Yet the core remained. The games were never just events. They were echoes of something older, something believed rather than verified. Listening to these stories by firelight or beneath open skies, people were reminded that their own lives, too, might someday become stories. To compete honorably was to leave a trace, however small, in the collective memory. Even if one's name was forgotten, the act itself mattered. In this way, myth did more than explain the origin of the games. It gave them emotional depth. It transformed physical contests into symbolic acts, linking muscle and movement to fate, memory, and belief. Without these stories, the games might have remained simple tests of ability. With them, they became rituals layered with meaning, capable of surviving long after the original tellers had disappeared. The myths did not seek to answer every question. Instead, they invited listeners to sit with uncertainty, to accept that beginnings are rarely clear and endings rarely final. They whispered that truth can be carried through story, even when facts blur. And so, whenever athletes gathered and spectators watched in attentive silence, the myths were present, invisible but powerful. They lived in every breath drawn before a race, every muscle tensed before a contest, every quiet hope lifted toward the sky. The games moved forward, guided not by a single origin, but by a chorus of voices from the distant past, each one reminding humanity why they had begun to run in the first place. At first, the gatherings felt temporary, almost fragile, as if they might dissolve the moment people stopped believing in them. Nothing about them suggested permanence. They happened, they ended, and life resumed its familiar uncertainty. Yet something subtle began to change as the years passed. The memory of these moments refused to fade. Instead, it returned persistent and patient, asking to be repeated. People began to notice the space between gatherings, not in days or months, but in feeling. There was a before and an after, a quiet sense that time itself had been marked. When the contest returned, they did not feel new, but expected, as though the land and the people alike had been waiting. Gradually, repetition took on meaning. What happened once could be remembered. What happened again could become tradition, without anyone declaring it so. The gathering settled into a rhythm that felt natural, even necessary. People planned around them. Journeys were timed. Conflicts were delayed. The cycle began to shape life rather than interrupt it. In a world without a shared calendar, this mattered deeply. Time was not counted in numbered years, but in events. Seasons were remembered by harvests and storms, by births and losses. Now, there was something else to measure by. The return of the games became a marker, a way of saying how long ago something had happened. Life began to organize itself around these recurring moments. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded quietly, shaped by memory and expectation. Elders spoke of past gatherings, recalling who had competed and how they had performed. Young people listened, imagining their own future participation. Stories bridged the gap between what had been and what was yet to come. The power of repetition lay in its reassurance. In an unpredictable world, the knowledge that something would return offered comfort. No matter what hardships arose, the cycle would continue. The games became a promise, not spoken aloud, but understood. With repetition came rules, not written at first, but felt. Certain behaviors became expected. Certain preparations became necessary. The gatherings were no longer spontaneous acts of devotion, but organized expressions of shared belief. Yet they retained their sacred quality, precisely because they were repeated. Each return reinforced their significance. As the cycle strengthened, it began to influence identity. Communities did not just attend the games. They remembered them together. Collective memory formed, binding individuals into something larger than themselves. To belong was to remember. To remember was to anticipate. This sense of continuity extended beyond human life. A man might compete in one gathering and return years later as a spectator. He might bring his children, pointing out where he once stood. In this way, the games linked generations, creating a shared narrative that outlived individual experience. Time itself seemed to bend around these moments. The days leading up to the gathering felt heavier, filled with preparation and quiet anticipation. The days following felt reflective, marked by retelling and interpretation. Ordinary life resumed, but it carried an echo of what had occurred. The cycles also brought contrast. Each gathering was compared to the last. Who ran faster? Who showed greater discipline? Who failed where another had succeeded? These comparisons were not purely competitive. They were contemplative. They invited reflection on effort, change, and the passage of time. Over time, the cycle became a way of understanding history. Events were placed in relation to the games. Victories in war, the founding of cities, even natural disasters were remembered by how many gatherings had passed since they occurred. The games became a framework for memory, anchoring personal and communal stories alike. This transformation from ritual to tradition did not strip the gatherings of mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The repetition raised new questions. Why did the cycle endure? Why did people feel compelled to maintain it, even when circumstances made it difficult? The answer lay not in obligation, but in meaning. By returning again and again, people reaffirmed their connection to the past. Each cycle was an act of remembrance, a way of honoring those who had stood on the same ground before. At the same time, it was an investment in the future, a promise that the story would continue. The rhythm of the games also created pauses in the relentless flow of conflict. Even when tensions ran high, the knowledge of an approaching gathering encouraged restraint. Time was no longer an unbroken march toward violence or loss. It had intervals of reflection, moments when focus shifted from survival to significance. In this way, the games began to shape not just memory, but behavior. They influenced how people perceived effort, patience, and endurance. Training took on a longer horizon. Preparation was no longer rushed. Athletes learned to pace themselves, to think in cycles rather than moments. This cyclical thinking mirrored the natural world. Seasons returned. Crops were planted and harvested. Life itself moved in patterns of birth and death. The games aligned human activity with these rhythms, reinforcing the sense that order existed beneath apparent chaos. As the tradition solidified, it gained resilience. Even when individual gatherings were disrupted or altered, the cycle remained intact. People trusted that it would return because it always had. This trust was powerful. It allowed the games to survive changes in leadership, belief, and circumstance. The shift from ritual to tradition also altered the emotional experience of the games. The first gatherings may have been tentative, charged with uncertainty. Now, they carried a quiet confidence. Participants knew what was expected, even if outcomes remained unpredictable. The structure provided stability, allowing emotion to flow within defined boundaries. This stability did not dull the impact. If anything, it sharpened it. Knowing that the games were part of a long chain made each moment feel more significant. A single race was not just a race. It was one link in an unbroken sequence stretching backward and forward in time. In this way, the games became more than events. They became time itself, measured and experienced through repetition. They taught people to think beyond the present, to situate their lives within a broader pattern, to run, to compete, to witness became acts of participation in something enduring. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible to those living through it. No one announced that a tradition had been born. It simply was, sustained by memory, belief, and the quiet human need for continuity. And as long as people returned, the cycle held, steady and patient, marking time not with numbers but with meaning. In a land shaped by rivalry and fractured by countless borders, the idea of peace was fragile, almost unfamiliar. Conflict was not an interruption to daily life in ancient Greece. It was woven into it. City-states competed for land, resources, honor, and influence, and war could erupt as suddenly as a storm over the sea. Generations grew up knowing that violence was never far away, that alliances shifted quickly, and that yesterday's neighbor could become tomorrow's enemy. Against this backdrop, the notion that fighting might simply stop, even briefly, felt almost unnatural. And yet, for the sake of the games, it did. Not because weapons lost their appeal, and not because grievances were resolved, but because something else was deemed more important, if only for a short span of time. The sacred truce was not a declaration of harmony. It was an agreement born of necessity and belief, delicate and tense. Messengers traveled across regions carrying the announcement, their words marking a pause rather than an end. Hostilities were to be suspended. Roads were to be made safe. Those journeying to the sacred ground were not to be harmed. This agreement demanded trust in a world where trust was rare. Each city-state had to believe that others would honor the same restraint. There were no armies enforcing the truce, no centralized power imposing punishment. What held it together was fear of divine anger and the shared understanding that violating the truce would invite consequences beyond human retaliation. The gods, it was believed, watched closely during this period. To disrupt the games was not merely an act of aggression. It was an offense against the sacred order. Stories circulated of those who ignored the truce and suffered misfortune. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the belief that they could be. As people prepared to travel, the atmosphere changed. Soldiers set aside their weapons, if only temporarily. Roads that had been dangerous became passable. Travelers who might otherwise have avoided one another shared paths, glancing cautiously but continuing onward. The journey itself became a symbol of the truce. To walk alongside a former enemy without striking was an act of restraint, a test of discipline as real as any athletic contest. Every step taken without violence reinforced a fragile peace. Arriving at the sacred ground, the contrast was striking. Men who had once faced each other across battlefields now stood together in silence, united by a shared purpose. The tension did not vanish, but was contained, held in check by ritual and expectation. The truce did not erase differences. It did not demand forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, it created a boundary within which conflict was transformed. Competition was permitted, even encouraged, but in a controlled form. Strength could be displayed, skill tested, pride challenged, without bloodshed. This transformation was powerful. It demonstrated that rivalry did not have to lead inevitably to destruction. For a brief time, energy that might have fueled war was redirected into ritualized struggle. The body became the site of contest rather than the battlefield. Yet the truce was always temporary, and everyone knew it. This knowledge lent the gathering a quiet urgency. The peace was precious precisely because it would not last. People were aware that once the games ended, old disputes might resume. This awareness sharpened attention, deepened emotion, and made each moment feel fragile. The sacred truce also served as a reminder of shared identity. Despite differences, the city-states recognized common beliefs, common gods, and common rituals. The games provided a space where these shared elements could surface, even amid deep divisions. Violations of the truce, when they occurred, were remembered for generations. They became cautionary tales, reminders of what happened when restraint failed. The shame associated with breaking the truce often outweighed any short-term gain. Reputation mattered deeply, and dishonor could linger long after wounds healed. For athletes, the truce carried personal significance. Many were citizens of states frequently at war. Their ability to travel safely, to compete openly, depended entirely on the agreement holding. Their presence at the games was itself proof that restraint had prevailed. Spectators, too, felt the weight of the truce. They understood that the gathering existed within borrowed time. The calm was deliberate, maintained through collective effort. Applause, cheers, and shared observation took on added meaning, framed by the knowledge that violence had been paused to allow them. The truce also shaped the moral landscape of the games. Honor was not just about winning. It was about participation within agreed limits. Respecting the truce became part of what it meant to compete rightly. An athlete who excelled but came from a city that violated the truce carried a shadow of doubt. This fragile piece offered a glimpse of what might be possible, without promising permanence. It suggested that humans were capable of restraint, even if only under specific conditions. It hinted at an alternative to endless conflict, without denying the reality of human aggression. Over time, the sacred truce became inseparable from the identity of the games. To speak of the gathering was to imply the pause in warfare. One could not exist without the other. The truce gave the games their gravity, transforming them from mere events into acts of collective will. When the games concluded and travelers returned home, the truce dissolved quietly. There were no ceremonies marking its end. Life resumed its familiar rhythms, including conflict. Yet something lingered, the memory of restraint, the knowledge that enemies had once stood side by side without striking. For some, this memory inspired hope. For others, it underscored the tragedy of its impermanence. But for all, it remained a powerful example of what belief, ritual, and shared commitment could achieve, even in a divided world. The sacred truce did not change human nature. It did not end war, but it carved out a space within time where violence was set aside in favor of meaning. And in doing so, it became one of the most profound, if fragile, achievements of the ancient games, a reminder that peace, however brief, is always a choice made anew. As the games grew in importance, the question of who could stand on the sacred ground became impossible to ignore. Participation was never open to all, and the boundaries that defined inclusion and exclusion revealed as much about ancient Greek values as the competitions themselves. These limits were not always spoken aloud, yet they were deeply understood, shaping expectations long before anyone arrived to compete. To be eligible was not simply a matter of strength or skill. It was a matter of identity. The games were rooted in shared belief, shared language, and shared ancestry. Those who did not fit within these definitions were rarely considered, not out of casual cruelty, but because belonging itself was sacred. The gathering was meant to reflect a particular vision of order, one that drew clear lines between inside and outside. Citizenship mattered deeply. A man represented not just himself, but his city, his lineage, and his honor. His presence carried the weight of collective identity. Victory reflected not only personal excellence, but the perceived favor and discipline of his homeland. Failure, too, could echo beyond the individual, shaping reputation and memory. This pressure shaped who was willing to compete. Only those confident in their standing, their preparation, and their legitimacy would step forward. The sacred ground was not a place to test belonging. It was a place to confirm it. Gender formed one of the most visible boundaries. The games were a space defined by male bodies, male competition, and male ideals of excellence. Women, regardless of their own strength or discipline, were largely excluded from participation, and even from attendance in certain contexts. This exclusion was not always framed as injustice, but as adherence to tradition and belief about roles within the cosmos. Yet the absence of women did not mean irrelevance. Their presence lingered in other ways, through rituals, through separate festivals, and through the social structures that supported the games. Mothers trained sons. Wives managed households during long absences. Their influence was indirect but essential, even if rarely acknowledged. Age, too, played a role. Youth and maturity were valued differently, and competitions reflected this. There was an understanding that the body changed over time, and that excellence was tied to specific phases of life. The games acknowledged this through varied categories, allowing different expressions of ability, without erasing hierarchy. Social status shaped opportunity as well. Training required time, resources, and access to facilities. Those burdened by constant labor or poverty found it difficult to prepare adequately. While the games celebrated idealized equality within competition, access to that competition was uneven. This tension between ideal and reality was rarely confronted directly. Instead, it was accepted as part of the natural order. Excellence was admired, but it was also understood to arise from circumstance as much as effort. Exclusion extended beyond formal rules. Behavior mattered. Those who had committed certain offenses, or who carried reputations of dishonor, found doors quietly close them. The sacred space demanded not only physical readiness, but moral standing, as defined by communal norms. Even those who qualified faced scrutiny. Lineage was examined. Claims of eligibility were questioned. The fear of impurity loomed large. Allowing the wrong person to compete was believed to invite divine displeasure, threatening the balance of the entire gathering. Spectators, too, were shaped by these boundaries. Attendance was not a passive act. To witness was to participate in the collective affirmation of values. Those present reinforced the definitions of belonging simply by being there. Yet exclusion also created longing. For those barred from participation, the games became symbols of what lay beyond reach. Stories carried their own power, allowing imagination to bridge gaps reality could not. In this way, the games influenced even those who never set foot on the sacred ground. The rules of inclusion and exclusion were not static. They shifted slowly, influenced by changing beliefs, political pressures, and cultural exchange. What remained constant was the idea that the games reflected an idealized vision of society, even when that vision was incomplete or contradictory. These boundaries served a purpose beyond control. They created focus. By narrowing who could compete, the games intensified meaning. Participation became an honor rather than a right, a privilege earned through alignment with collective identity. At the same time, the limits exposed cracks within that identity. Questions lingered beneath the surface. Who truly belonged? Who decided? These questions were rarely resolved, but they shaped the emotional landscape of the games. For those who did compete, awareness of exclusion heightened responsibility. Standing on the sacred ground meant carrying the expectations of those left behind. Every movement was watched not just by spectators, but by memory itself. The games, then, were as much about absence as presence. The empty spaces spoke quietly of boundaries drawn, of voices unheard, of potential unrealized. These silences did not diminish the tradition. They defined it. Through inclusion and exclusion, the games revealed the values and limitations of society that created them. They were mirrors, reflecting both aspiration and constraint. And in that reflection, ancient Greece saw not only who it celebrated, but who it chose to leave at the edge of the sacred ground. Long before an athlete ever stepped onto the sacred ground, the true contest had already begun in quiet places far from the crowd. It unfolded in dusty courtyards, open fields, and simple training grounds where repetition ruled the day and no one watched but the sun and the passing wind. Preparation was not rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and often lonely, shaped by the understanding that the body was not merely a tool, but a vessel that carried intention, discipline, and belief. Training the body in ancient Greece was not about excess or spectacle. It was about balance. Muscles were strengthened not to dominate, but to endure. Speed was cultivated not for flash, but for control. Every movement was refined through endless repetition, each action repeated until it felt natural, almost effortless. Sweat soaked into ground day after day, unnoticed, yet essential. Athletes rose early, often before the heat settled into the land. The air at dawn was cool and still, offering a brief sense of clarity before exertion began. Exercises were simple, yet demanding. Running across uneven terrain hardened the legs and lungs. Lifting stones built strength in a way that felt honest, connected directly to the earth. Wrestling tested not just power, but patience, requiring awareness of balance, timing, and restraint. Pain was expected. Soreness was not a sign of failure, but of progress. There were no promises of reward beyond the knowledge that the body was becoming more capable, more aligned with its purpose. Injuries were accepted risks, reminders of limitation rather than reasons to stop. Yet physical preparation alone was never enough. The body, no matter how strong, was believed to falter without proper alignment of the inner self. The Greeks understood that fear, doubt, and arrogance could undo months of training in a single moment. To prepare fully, the athlete had to quiet the mind. This mental discipline took many forms. Some athletes practiced silence, learning to be alone with their thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. Others repeated prayers or meditative routines, grounding themselves in familiar rhythms. Visualization, though not named as such, was instinctive. Athletes imagined the race, the contest, the moment of effort, not to guarantee victory, but to reduce surprise. Surprise was dangerous. The unknown unsettled the mind. An unsettled mind weakened the body. Preparation aimed to make the unfamiliar feel familiar, to soften the shock of competition through anticipation. Spiritual readiness was woven seamlessly into this process. Training spaces often doubled as places of worship. Before exertion, offerings might be made, small and personal. A handful of grain, a quiet promise, a moment of stillness. These acts were not about bargaining, but acknowledgement. The athlete recognized forces beyond personal control and sought harmony rather than dominance. Diet, too, was approached with intention. Food was fuel, but also discipline. Excess dulled the senses. Hunger sharpened them. Athletes learned to eat simply, consistently, understanding that restraint strengthened resolve. Meals became rituals, marking the rhythm of training days. As the games approached, training intensified, but anxiety also grew. Doubt crept in during quiet moments. Was the body ready? Had enough been done? These questions were universal, shared by every athlete regardless of experience. The difference lay in how they were met. Those who succeeded learned to accept uncertainty rather than fight it. They understood that no amount of preparation could eliminate risk. Instead of seeking control, they cultivated acceptance. This acceptance was not passive. It was grounded in trust, in the knowledge that effort itself carried meaning. Community played a subtle but important role. While training was often solitary, athletes were rarely unsupported. Mentors offered guidance. Elders shared stories of past contests, not to intimidate, but to normalize struggle. These shared memories provided perspective, reminding athletes that fear had always accompanied effort. As departure neared, training shifted again. The body was allowed moments of rest. The muscles eased, the mind given space to settle. Overtraining was understood to be dangerous, a sign of desperation rather than confidence. Knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to push. The journey to the games became part of preparation itself. Travel tested endurance, patience, and adaptability. Roads were long, conditions unpredictable. Fatigue accumulated. Yet the strain served a purpose, reminding athletes that competition did not occur in isolation. It was part of a larger experience, one that demanded resilience beyond the arena. Upon arrival, preparation took on a new tone. The sacred ground altered perception. Movement slowed. Voices softened. Training continued, but with reverence. Every action felt observed, not just by others, but by the space itself. The land demanded respect, and athletes responded instinctively. Cleansing rituals marked the transition from training to competition. Water washed away dust and fatigue, but also symbolized readiness. The athlete stepped forward not as a private individual, but as a representative of something larger. In these final moments, preparation turned inward. Muscles rested. Breath steadied. The mind settled into focus. There was no dramatic buildup, no forced excitement. Instead, There was calm, born of familiarity with effort and acceptance of outcome. The true achievement of preparation lay not in victory, but in readiness. To stand prepared was to accept whatever followed, knowing that the body had been trained, the mind disciplined, and the spirit aligned. This preparation shaped character as much as performance. It taught patience, humility, and respect for limits. It reminded athletes that excellence was not a moment, but a process, unfolding slowly through dedication and restraint. When the time came to compete, the athlete did not arrive empty-handed. He carried with him countless unseen hours, silent struggles, and quiet acts of devotion. Each step onto the sacred ground was supported by a foundation built far away, through effort no one else had witnessed. In this way, training the body was inseparable from preparing the soul. Both were required, both were tested, and together, they formed the invisible structure beneath the games, a reminder that what appeared effortless on the surface was sustained by depth, discipline, and belief cultivated long before the crowd ever gathered. When the moment finally arrived, it did not announce itself with sudden noise or spectacle. Instead, it emerged from a hush, a collective stillness that settled over the gathering like a held breath. Athletes stepped forward not with raised arms or dramatic gestures, but with measured calm, aware that every movement carried weight. The ground beneath their feet was firm, uneven, familiar, and sacred, and it reminded them that what was about to happen was as much ritual as it was contest. The events themselves were simple in form, yet immense in consequence. There were no elaborate tools, no protective barriers, no illusions of safety. Bodies were the instruments, and the limits of those bodies were tested openly, without concealment. Running was not guided by lanes or measured by precise distances, but by instinct and endurance. The start was marked by readiness rather than command, and the finish by collapse rather than celebration. Spectators watched with a focus sharpened by silence. They did not yet cheer wildly. They observed. They waited. Every stride mattered. A stumble was not just a mistake. It was a moment that revealed vulnerability. The dust kicked up by bare feet hung briefly in the air, catching sunlight before settling again, as if the earth itself acknowledged the effort. Speed was admired, but control was revered. An athlete who ran with composure, conserving energy and maintaining form, inspired a quiet respect. Victory achieved through reckless force was less impressive than victory shaped by discipline. The body, after all, was seen as an expression of inner order. Then there were contests of strength, where bodies collided and balance became everything. Wrestling matches unfolded close to the ground, muscles taut, breaths heavy, skin slick with oil and sweat. These struggles were intimate, almost private, despite the crowd. Each grip, each shift of weight carried intention. Brute force alone rarely succeeded. Timing, awareness, and patience decided outcomes. Pain was visible, yet rarely dramatized. A grimace, a tightened jaw. Endurance was expected, and complaint was unnecessary. The audience understood this language. They recognized effort not through cries, but through restraint. To endure without display was to honor the spirit of the games. Some events carried an edge of danger that unsettled even seasoned spectators. Striking contests demanded precision and courage, not just strength. A single misjudgment could lead to serious injury. Yet participants accepted this risk as part of the offering. Safety was secondary to sincerity. The willingness to face danger demonstrated commitment. Throughout the events, there was an underlying awareness of control. Violence was permitted, but only within boundaries. The difference between contest and chaos was thin, and it was maintained through shared understanding. An athlete who crossed that line risked disgrace, regardless of outcome. Judgment was not purely objective. There were no detailed rule books or instant decisions. Outcomes were shaped by observation, tradition, and consensus. This ambiguity added tension, but also emphasized character. How an athlete behaved mattered as much as what he achieved. Between events, there were pauses that felt intentional. Athletes rested. Spectators reflected. These moments of stillness balanced the intensity of competition, preventing the gathering from tipping into frenzy. The rhythm of action and rest mirrored the cycles of training and preparation that had led to this point. As contests unfolded, narratives formed quietly. A competitor who struggled early but persisted drew admiration, One who dominated effortlessly provoked both awe and unease. Each performance was interpreted not just as skill, but as story, adding to the collective memory. The sun moved slowly overhead, marking time without urgency. Sweat evaporated. Shadows shifted. The passage of hours felt different here, stretched by attention and significance. No one seemed eager for it to end. The crowd's reactions remained restrained, but not absent. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, a shared intake of breath, a low sound of approval. These subtle responses reinforced connection without overwhelming the solemnity of the moment. Victory, when it came, was understated. There were no raised fists or shouted declarations. The winner stood, breathing heavily, often uncertain how to hold himself. Pride was tempered by exhaustion. The body had given everything, leaving little room for celebration. Defeat, too, was met with composure. A fallen athlete rose slowly, accepting the outcome without protest. To argue was to misunderstand the purpose of the contest. Loss was not humiliation. It was participation without triumph. What made these events endure was not their variety, but their consistency. The same test, repeated over generations, allowed comparison across time. Spectators remembered past performances, measuring the present against memory. This continuity deepened meaning, transforming isolated efforts into part of a larger narrative. Despite the physical intensity, there was an absence of spectacle as modern audiences might understand it. No music, no embellishment, no attempt to heighten drama artificially. The drama emerged naturally from effort, risk, and uncertainty. The simplicity sharpened focus, stripping away distraction. The controlled violence of certain events forced confrontation with human limits. Blood might appear, bones might strain, yet within this risk lay truth. The body was revealed honestly, without armor or illusion. Strength and fragility existed side by side. Through these contests, spectators were reminded of their own bodies, their own struggles. The games were not distant displays, they were reflections. Watching someone endure pain without retreat stirred recognition. It suggested that endurance itself was a shared human experience. As the final events concluded, fatigue settled over the gathering like dusk. The ground bore marks of effort, footprints, disturbed dust, impressions of bodies pressed into earth. These traces lingered briefly before fading, but the memory remained. The events had fulfilled their purpose, not by entertaining, but by revealing. They showed what the human body could do when disciplined and devoted. They showed how competition could exist without hatred, violence without chaos. In the quiet that followed, there was a sense of completion, not closure. The contest ended, but their impact stretched beyond the moment. Stories would be told, performances remembered. The cycle would continue. The events of the games were not meant to astonish. They were meant to endure, to repeat, to remind. Through strength, speed, and controlled violence, they spoke a language older than words, one that the body understood instinctively. And in that language, the games found their lasting power. When the contests were over and the dust had begun to settle, what remained was not wealth, not material reward, and not even certainty of lasting fame. For the victor standing quietly among others, the prize was deceptively simple: a wreath of olive leaves cut from a sacred tree, placed gently upon the head. No gold, no silver, no treasure carried home in chests. And yet, this modest offering carried a weight that far exceeded its appearance. To the ancient mind, the absence of material reward was not a flaw, but a deliberate choice. Victory was meant to be clean, unburdened by greed. Wealth could be earned elsewhere. Here, the reward was recognition, something less tangible and therefore more powerful. It was the acknowledgement that, in this moment, effort and discipline had aligned with favor. The olive wreath was not chosen for its beauty, though it possessed a quiet elegance. It was chosen for its symbolism. The olive tree was associated with endurance, longevity, and peace. Its leaves did not fade quickly. They resisted decay. To wear them was to be marked by qualities valued far beyond physical strength. Receiving the wreath was a restrained ceremony. There was no explosion of celebration. The victor did not raise it triumphantly. Instead, it rested lightly, almost humbly, reminding both the wearer and the onlookers that achievement was fleeting. The leaves would dry. The moment would pass. Memory was the true prize. This emphasis on honor over wealth shaped how victory was understood. Winning was not an end, but a moment within a larger life. The athlete was celebrated not as a conqueror, but as a model of discipline. Praise focused on conduct as much as outcome. How the victory was achieved mattered deeply. Returning home, the victor carried no visible proof of success, yet recognition followed him nonetheless. Stories traveled faster than objects. Word spread through markets, streets, and gatherings. Names were spoken with admiration. Families felt pride not just in the individual, but in the reflection cast upon their lineage and city. Cities welcomed victors with ceremonies that transformed personal achievement into communal honor. Gates might be opened ceremonially, feasts held, songs composed. These celebrations were not mandated by the games, but by local custom. They demonstrated how a simple wreath could generate lasting social reward. Privileges often followed. Victors might receive meals at public expense, front row seats at future events, or lifelong honors that eased daily burdens. These rewards were not immediate nor guaranteed, but they reinforced the idea that honor, once earned, reshaped life quietly and persistently. The contrast between the simplicity of the prize and the magnitude of its impact was intentional. It taught a lesson. True achievement did not need embellishment. It spoke for itself, carried by memory and respect rather than material excess. For those who did not win, this understanding softened loss. To compete was already to participate in honor. While victory elevated one individual, the structure ensured that ambition did not turn toxic. The absence of wealth reduced envy and resentment, preserving the communal spirit of the games. Yet the desire for recognition was powerful. Athletes trained for years not for riches, but for remembrance. To be known, even briefly, as the best among peers was enough. In a world where most lives passed without record, this form of immortality was deeply compelling. Poets and historians preserved names, embedding them into cultural memory. A victor's identity could outlast his body, living on in verse and story. This form of remembrance elevated the games beyond physical contests, transforming them into vehicles of legacy. Honor also carried responsibility. A victor was expected to embody the values of the games beyond the competition. Public behavior mattered. Arrogance or misconduct could tarnish reputation, undermining the very honor that had been earned. Victory was not ownership. It was stewardship. This expectation reinforced restraint. To win was not to rise above others permanently, but to be held to a higher standard. The community watched closely, ready to praise or condemn based on conduct. The fragility of honor was part of its power. It could not be stored or protected. It existed only as long as it was upheld. This impermanence mirrored the olive wreath itself, destined to wither. Both reminded the victor that achievement was a moment, not a possession. Over time, as the games evolved, this philosophy faced challenges. Wealth and politics began to press inward, yet the original ideal remained influential, a benchmark against which later changes were measured. The image of the simple wreath persisted, symbolizing purity of intent. The absence of material reward also preserved the sacred nature of the games. They remained offerings rather than transactions. Effort was given, not exchanged. This distinction mattered deeply in a culture sensitive to balance and reciprocity. Spectators understood this as well. They admired victory not because it promised advantage, but because it demonstrated alignment with values they shared. The moment of crowning was quiet, but heavy with meaning. In this way, the games taught a subtle lesson about worth. What endured was not what could be touched, but what could be remembered. The olive wreath, modest and temporary, became a powerful symbol precisely because it asked so little and offered so much. When the leaves finally dried and fell away, what remained was a story, a name spoken, a moment recalled, a standard upheld, and in that quiet endurance of memory, the true reward of victory revealed itself, lasting far longer than any treasure ever could. While athletes drew much of the visible attention, the true heartbeat of the games pulsed to the crowd that gathered around them. The festival was never confined to the contest alone. It spilled outward into every path, tent, and shaded clearing, forming a temporary world that existed only for a short time and then vanished again. To arrive was to step into a living current of movement, sound, and shared presence. People came from far beyond the surrounding valleys. They arrived on foot, by cart, by boat, carrying food, tools, offerings, and stories. The journey itself was part of the experience, marked by anticipation and uncertainty. As travelers approached the sacred site, they joined streams of others moving in the same direction, strangers bound together by purpose. Conversation sparked easily along the way, fueled by curiosity and cautious excitement. The festival grounds transformed quickly. Temporary shelters rose, fires were lit, and familiar paths emerged as if guided by memory rather than instruction. The air filled with overlapping sounds, voices speaking in different accents, laughter rising and fading, footsteps pressing into dust. There was no single focal point at first. The energy was diffuse, spread evenly across the gathering. Merchants set up stalls at the edges, careful not to intrude upon sacred space. They offered simple goods, food, drink, small tokens, items meant to sustain rather than distract. Transactions were brief, almost secondary. The true exchange was social. News traveled quickly. Alliances were discussed. Old acquaintances reunited, measuring time by how many games had passed since they last met. Priests moved quietly among the crowd, maintaining rituals, interpreting signs, ensuring that the sacred balance was respected. Their presence added gravity, reminding everyone that this was not merely a fair or market, but a gathering watched by higher forces. Spectators found places to sit or stand, guided less by a sign seating than by instinct. Groups formed and dissolved naturally. Families stayed close. Elders observed with calm attention. Younger faces leaned forward, eager, absorbing every detail. The games were lessons as much as spectacles, teaching through observation rather than instruction. The atmosphere carried an undercurrent of restraint. Despite the size of the gathering, chaos rarely erupted. The sacred truths lingered in behavior as well as in law. People were mindful of their actions, aware that they stood among rivals as well as neighbors. Courtesy was not just polite, it was necessary. Between events, the crowd breathed. People rested, shared meals, exchanged impressions. Stories were retold even before events fully concluded, shaped by emotion and interpretation. Each person carried a slightly different version, enriching the collective narrative. The presence of so many bodies created a unique sensory experience. Heat radiated from sun-warmed skin. Dust clung to clothing and hair. The smell of sweat, earth, and cooked food mingled, grounding the experience in the physical. This was not an abstract gathering. It was intensely real. Children darted through open spaces, mimicking athletes in play, their laughter weaving to the more subdued sounds of adults. For them, the games were formative memories, shaping how they understood community and identity. They watched heroes emerge not from stories, but from flesh and effort. As the day progressed, the mood shifted subtly. Fatigue settled in, softening voices and movements. The initial excitement gave way to contemplation. People grew quieter, more inward. The spectacle did not demand constant reaction. It invited reflection. The crowd was not passive. Their attention shaped the events. Athletes felt it, sensed when focus sharpened or waned. Silence carried meaning. A hushed audience amplified intensity more than noise ever could. It signaled respect, anticipation, and shared understanding. Festivals have a way of blurring boundaries, and this gathering was no different. Social hierarchies softened temporarily. People of different status stood side by side, united by observation. For a brief time, the distinctions that governed daily life felt less rigid. Yet the festival also reinforced identity. Cities clustered together. Banners and symbols marked affiliation. Pride was visible in posture and dress. Spectators watched not only athletes, but one another, measuring strength, discipline, and demeanor. As night approached, the atmosphere changed again. Fires glowed softly, casting flickering light across faces and tents. Conversations deepened. Stories took on reflective tones. The intensity of competition gave way to communal stillness. The festival was as much about presence as action. Simply being there mattered. To witness was to participate. Memory formed through shared experience, binding individuals into a collective story that would be carried home and retold. When the games ended and the crowd began to disperse, the energy did not vanish immediately. It lingered, trailing behind travelers as they returned to their lives. The temporary world dissolved, leaving behind impressions, conversations, and memories. This gathering, repeated across generations, shaped how people understood themselves and one another. It reminded them that they were part of something larger, something that existed beyond daily struggles and rivalries. The unspoken energy of the crowd was essential to the game's endurance. Without it, contests would have been empty gestures. With it, they became living rituals, sustained by shared attention and collective belief. In the quiet moments after departure, when the grounds returned to stillness, traces remained: flattened grass, worn paths, lingering scents. These marks faded, but the memory of the crowd persisted, waiting to be renewed at the next gathering, when voices would once again fill the air and the festival would briefly come alive. At the heart of the games, beneath every contest and every gathering, there was a constant awareness that nothing unfolded by chance alone. Religion was not a separate layer added onto the event. It was a foundation upon which everything rested. The games existed because the gods were believed to be present, attentive, and capable of influence. Every movement, every outcome, every delay carried the possibility of meaning. Before any contest could begin, the sacred atmosphere had to be acknowledged and maintained. The space itself demanded preparation, just as the athletes did. Priests oversaw rituals with calm precision, their actions shaped by generations of practice. These were not hurried gestures, but deliberate ones, carried out with an understanding that carelessness could invite disaster. A misplaced offering, an ignored sign, or a rushed prayer could unsettle the balance. Sacrifice stood at the center of this religious rhythm. Animals were offered not as acts of cruelty, but as exchanges meant to sustain harmony between human and divine realms. The act was solemn, marked by silence and focused attention. Smoke rose steadily into the sky, carrying scent and intention upward. Participants watched closely, reading the behavior of the flames, the direction of the smoke, the smallest details that might signal approval or warning. These moments were heavy with expectation. The gods did not speak plainly. They communicated through suggestion, through subtle shifts that required interpretation. A sudden breeze, an unexpected sound, a flicker of movement could be read as response. Priests and elders bore the responsibility of interpretation, their words shaping how the gathering would proceed. Prayer accompanied every stage of the games. Athletes prayed quietly, often alone, their requests simple and restrained. They did not ask for victory outright, but for strength, clarity, and fairness. To ask too boldly was dangerous, an invitation to divine correction. Humility was essential. The gods respected effort, not arrogance. Spectators participated as well, though less visibly. Many carried personal concerns into sacred space, hoping that proximity to ritual might amplify their prayers. The games offered a rare moment when the divine felt closer, more accessible. To be present was to stand within a charged environment where ordinary boundaries softened. Religion shaped not only ritual, but interpretation of events. A victory was rarely attributed solely to skill. It was seen as alignment between preparation, character, and divine favor. Likewise, defeat carried meaning beyond failure. It could signal imbalance, neglect, or a lesson yet to be understood. This framework softened harsh judgment. Outcomes were not final statements about worth, but moments within an ongoing relationship with the divine. Omens were taken seriously. Unusual occurrences before or during the games prompted discussion and caution. A sudden illness, a strange animal behavior, a shift in weather could delay events or alter plans. These decisions were not seen as superstitious overreactions, but as prudent respect. To ignore signs was to invite consequences that could extend far beyond the gathering. This constant attention to the divine created a unique atmosphere. The games unfolded under a sense of watchfulness that restrained excess and sharpened focus. Athletes competed intensely, but rarely recklessly. Spectators observed closely, aware that inappropriate behavior could offend the gods as much as physical transgression. The religious dimension also reinforced equality within the sacred space. Before the gods, all stood exposed. Wealth, status, and power mattered less than sincerity. Offerings varied in size, but intention mattered more than scale. This understanding helped temper social divisions, at least temporarily. At the same time, religion reinforced hierarchy in subtle ways. Priests held authority not through force, but through perceived access to divine will. Their interpretations could elevate or diminish reputations, influence decisions, and shape memory. This power was respected, but also approached cautiously, aware that misinterpretation carried risk. Festivals dedicated to the gods were not rare in ancient Greece, but the games held a special position because they combined physical exertion with worship so seamlessly. The body itself became an offering. Sweat, pain, and endurance were presented as acts of devotion. This idea gave physical struggle a sacred dimension, transforming exertion into prayer. Athletes internalized this belief deeply. Training was not just preparation for competition, but for ritual participation. The body had to be worthy of presentation. Discipline was not merely practical, it was moral. Neglecting training was not just laziness, but disrespect. This integration of religion and physicality shaped how people understood health and strength. A capable body suggested harmony with divine order. Illness or weakness invited reflection, sometimes compassion, sometimes suspicion. The line between physical condition and moral standing was thin. As the games progressed, rituals punctuated the schedule, creating a rhythm that balanced intensity with reflection. Sacrifices marked beginnings and endings. Prayers framed transitions. These pauses prevented the gathering from becoming overwhelming, allowing participants to reconnect with purpose. Even moments of joy were tempered by reverence. Celebration existed, but it was measured. Excessive revelry risked offense. The goal was balance, mirroring the ideal relationship between humans and gods. When accidents or injuries occurred, they were interpreted carefully. Some saw them as warnings, others as tests. Rarely were they dismissed as meaningless. This interpretive lens encouraged attentiveness and humility, reminding everyone that control was limited. The religious core of the games also preserved continuity across generations. Rituals changed slowly, guarded by tradition. This stability offered reassurance in a changing world. Even as political and social landscapes shifted, the sacred framework remained familiar. Yet religion within the games was not static. Beliefs evolved. Interpretations shifted. New influences entered. Still, the central idea endured. The games were not solely human affairs. They were dialogues between effort and fate. As participants prepared to leave, final offerings were made. Gratitude was expressed, regardless of outcome. To leave without acknowledgement was unthinkable. Departure rituals marked closure, sealing the gathering within memory. Long after the crowd dispersed, the sacred ground retained its charge. It waited quietly, holding the residue of prayer and effort. When the next cycle approached, rituals would awaken again, reconnecting past and present. In this way, religion did not merely accompany the games. It sustained them. It provided meaning when outcomes puzzled, comfort when efforts failed, and humility when success arrived. It reminded everyone present that beneath strength and speed lay a deeper question, not just who prevailed, but how humans related to the unseen forces they believed shaped their world. Through offerings, omens, and belief, the games became more than contests. They became acts of alignment, moments when humanity reached upward through effort, hoping to be acknowledged, guided, or at least understood by powers that remain forever just beyond reach. Even within a tradition shaped by reverence, discipline, and belief, human nature never fully disappeared. Where honor was prized so highly, the temptation to bend rules quietly followed. The games, for all their sacred framing, were not immune to deceit. In fact, the higher the value placed on victory, the greater the shadow cast by those willing to reach for it by improper means. Cheating did not always appear as a dramatic act. It often began subtly, hidden beneath intention and rationalization. An athlete might exaggerate his lineage, claiming eligibility where none existed. Another might offer gifts quietly, hoping to influence judgment. Some trained in secret beyond agreed limits, or used tactics that crossed the invisible line between strategy and violation. Rarely did cheaters see themselves as corrupt. More often, they believed the outcome justified the method. The danger of cheating lay not only in unfair advantage, but in imbalance. The games were believed to function correctly only when harmony existed between effort, conduct, and divine observation. To cheat was to disrupt that harmony. It was not simply an offense against other competitors, but against the gods themselves. Because of this, the response to cheating was severe, even when proof was uncertain. Punishment aimed not to correct behavior quietly, but to restore balance publicly. Shame, rather than pain, was a chosen instrument. When a violation was discovered, it was addressed openly. The individual was named, the offense described. Silence often followed, heavier than any outcry. The crowd did not need to react loudly. The exposure itself carried weight. Punishments varied, but they were always designed to linger. Fines were common, but money alone was insufficient. Offenders were often required to fund public reminders of their disgrace. Objects or inscriptions placed within the sacred space, ensuring that their names endured not as victors, but as warnings. These reminders served a dual purpose. They punished the individual and educated the community. Future athletes passed them as they trained, reading names etched into stone, absorbing the lesson without words. The message was clear. Effort without integrity leads not to honor, but to lasting humiliation. Shame in ancient Greek culture was not fleeting. Reputation extended beyond individual, touching family, city, and lineage. To be publicly exposed as dishonest damaged more than a career. It altered how one was spoken of, remembered, and trusted. This social weight often surpassed the fear of physical punishment. Because memory was so powerful, even accusations carried risk. To be suspected of cheating, even without conviction, could cast a shadow. Athletes guarded not only their actions, but their appearance, their associations, their demeanor. Perception mattered deeply. The line between suspicion and certainty was thin, and few were willing to risk crossing it. Judges bore heavy responsibility. Their decisions shaped outcomes and reputations. They were expected to embody impartiality, guided by tradition and observation rather than personal interest. Any hint of bias or corruption threatened the legitimacy of the entire gathering. Judgment was not instantaneous. Disputes were discussed, evidence weighed, testimonies considered. This process, though imperfect, reinforced the seriousness of the games. They were not casual contests where outcomes could be shrugged away. Each decision mattered. The existence of punishment also reinforced belief. It demonstrated that the games were governed by order, not chaos. That effort mattered, but so did ethics. That even in competition, restraint and honesty were expected. Yet fear of shame did not eliminate cheating entirely. It merely pushed it deeper into secrecy. This tension added another layer of complexity to the games. Behind the visible displays of discipline lay invisible struggles of conscience. Some athletes faced moral dilemmas quietly. The pressure to succeed was immense. Honor promised lasting recognition, while failure faded quickly. In moments of doubt, temptation whispered. Was bending a rule truly dishonorable if no one noticed? Was it not better to win for one's city than to lose honestly? These internal conflicts humanized the competitors. They revealed that the games were not populated by idealized figures, but by individuals wrestling with ambition and fear. The presence of rules and punishments acknowledged this reality rather than denying it. Spectators, too, were aware of these tensions. Whispers circulated. Suspicions formed. A victory that seemed too effortless invited scrutiny. Applause was sometimes tempered by doubt. The skepticism did not weaken the games. It sharpened attention. When punishment occurred, it often restored confidence. The exposure of wrongdoing reassured the community that integrity mattered, that vigilance existed, that no one stood above the sacred framework. The fear of shame extended beyond the competition itself. Athletes knew that conduct during training, travel, and preparation could be scrutinized. Misbehavior away from the arena could influence perception. The games demanded consistency, not just performance. In this way, discipline became comprehensive. To compete honorably required sustained integrity, not momentary compliance. The athlete was judged as a whole, not only by outcome. This emphasis on shame as deterrence reflected deeper cultural values. Honor was collective. One person's disgrace could reflect on many. This interconnectedness reinforced responsibility. To act dishonestly was to burden others with the consequences. Over time, stories of cheaters became cautionary tales, retold alongside heroic victories. Children learned these stories early, absorbing lessons about integrity long before understanding competition. Shame educated as effectively as praise. The presence of punishment also preserved balance between ambition and humility. It reminded athletes that the games were not avenues for personal gain alone. They were sacred acts bound by expectation. Even those never caught carried awareness of risk. The possibility of exposure lingered, shaping behavior through fear as much as belief. This invisible pressure maintained order without constant enforcement. As centuries passed, the methods of cheating evolved, as did detection. Yet the underlying dynamic remained. Where honor existed, temptation followed. Where temptation arose, shame waited. In this ongoing tension, the games revealed something essential about human nature. That striving for excellence invites both nobility and corruption. That systems of meaning must account for both. The punishments, harsh as they were, served not to erase wrongdoing, but to integrate it into the narrative. Cheating became part of the story, not as triumph, but as warning. It reminded everyone present that the pursuit of honor required vigilance, humility, and restraint. Through fear of shame and the weight of memory, the games maintained their integrity, not because humans were flawless, but because the consequences of dishonesty were woven deeply into the fabric of the tradition. And in that quiet understanding, each athlete stepped forward knowing that victory achieved without honor was worse than defeat endured honestly. As the centuries passed and the games grew in prestige, they did not remain untouched by the shifting currents of power that moved through the Greek world. What had once existed primarily as sacred ritual and communal gatherings slowly attracted attention from those who understood influence in different terms. Rulers, leaders, and ambitious figures began to see the games not only as offerings to the gods, but as stages upon which authority could be displayed and reinforced. At first, this influence was subtle. City-states took quiet pride in their athletes, seeing victory as a reflection of collective strength and discipline. A champion was not just an individual success, but proof that a community thrived under its leaders. Praise was shared generously, yet without overt manipulation. The connection between politics and competition felt natural, almost inevitable. Over time, however, intention sharpened. Leaders recognized that public attention could be guided. Sponsoring athletes became a way to shape perception. Investment in training facilities, coaches, and preparation increased, not solely out of respect for tradition, but because success translated into prestige. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, often framed as support rather than strategy. Resources were justified as necessary for honoring the gods and upholding excellence. Few objected, as improved preparation benefited athletes and communities alike. Yet beneath the surface, the games were becoming entangled with ambition. Political presence at the games became more pronounced. Leaders attended in greater numbers, occupying visible positions. Their behavior was carefully observed. How they interacted, where they sat, whom they praised, all communicated messages. The sacred gathering became a forum where alliances were hinted at and rivalries subtly displayed. Victories were increasingly celebrated as political statements. A city that produced champions gained leverage, its reputation amplified. Diplomatic discussions took place alongside festivals, facilitated by the truce. The games offered rare opportunities for leaders to meet without immediate threat of violence. This blending of ritual and politics introduced tension. The games have been valued as neutral ground, belonging to no one. Political influence risked tipping this balance. Accusations of favoritism began to surface. Decisions once accepted quietly were scrutinized more closely. Athletes felt this shift acutely. Some found themselves caught between devotion to tradition and loyalty to sponsors. Expectations changed. Success was no longer purely personal or communal. It carried political weight. Failure could disappoint not just families, but leaders. For some, this pressure intensified training and focus. For others, it introduced anxiety and moral conflict. The games, once places of spiritual alignment, now bore the weight of political consequence. Public displays of generosity became tools of influence. Leaders funded buildings, rituals, and celebrations, their names associated with enhancement of the sacred space. While these contributions improved infrastructure, they also reshaped memory. The line between piety and self-promotion blurred. Spectators, too, became more politically aware. They watched not only athletes, but leaders. Applause and attention could signal approval or dissent. The crowd's reaction mattered, adding another layer of complexity to the gathering. The presence of power did not erase reverence, but altered tone. The games remained sacred, yet they now serve multiple purposes. Religious devotion coexisted with political theater. This coexistence was uneasy but enduring. Conflict sometimes emerged. Disputes over eligibility, judging, or honor took on political dimensions. Accusations were amplified, stakes heightened. Decisions carried implications beyond the arena. Yet the sacred framework resisted complete takeover. Rituals and belief imposed limits. Leaders were cautious not to overstep, aware that blatant manipulation could provoke backlash or divine displeasure. This restraint preserved a measure of balance. As influence spread, the games reflected broader changes in Greek society. Power centralized. Competition intensified. Identity became more contested. The gathering mirrored these shifts, absorbing tension without collapsing. For some, this evolution represented decline. They remembered earlier simplicity, mourning what felt lost. For others, it was natural growth, proof that the games remained relevant. The interplay between politics and tradition did not resolve neatly. It remained dynamic, negotiated anew with each cycle. The games endured not because they were pure, but because they adapted. In this adaptation, they revealed a truth about institutions. Those at last must absorb change without losing core meaning. The games balanced sacred purpose with political reality, imperfectly but persistently. As long as the rituals continued and belief held, the presence of power could be contained. Yet the seeds of transformation had been planted, shaping the future in ways not yet fully visible. The stadium had become more than a place of contest. It was now a stage where strength, belief, and authority intersected. And in that intersection, the games continued, carrying forward both their ancient roots and the marks of human ambition. As the games stretched across decades and centuries, their nature began to shift in ways that were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deeply significant. What had once been a gathering rooted in sacred ritual, communal effort, and reverence for the gods slowly transformed into a tradition layered with memory, expectation, and social continuity. The rhythm of the games, once dictated by instinct and seasonal cycles, became a measuring stick against which generations marked the passage of time. With each repetition, the weight of history settled more firmly upon the sacred ground. The games were no longer fleeting interruptions in daily life. They had begun to define it. Families planned around them. Training cycles were established not only for immediate competition, but for long-term preparation, spanning years and even decades. Communities learned to anticipate the coming of the games, aligning labor, travel, and ritual with their arrival. In this way, the games shaped human behavior far beyond the confines of the arena. Memory played a central role in this evolution. Elders recounted past performances, describing victories and defeats with meticulous care. Names are preserved in oral histories. Stories passed from parent to child. Even as physical evidence faded, tracks in the dust, impressions of athletes on the ground, the recollection of effort, discipline, and outcome endured. This living memory gave the games a sense of permanence, linking present participants with those who had come before, and providing a model for those yet to arrive. The repetition of events created expectation. Spectators and competitors alike came to know not only what would happen, but how it should unfold. Certain rituals were repeated with precision, offerings made in a particular order, sequences of movement practiced and honored, moments of silence observed at key intervals. These repetitions were not rigid. They allowed for subtle variation, but they also created a framework that gave meaning to effort. Familiarity bred reverence. To step onto the sacred ground was to participate in a continuum, to place oneself within the flow of generations. The cyclical nature of the games reinforced the notion of time as both physical and symbolic. Years were measured not merely by the passage of seasons or the reign of rulers, but by the interval between gatherings. Communities marked events in relation to games, a harvest before or after a competition, a birth or death in proximity to a cycle. Time itself became intertwined with ritual. The rhythm of the games imposed order on lives otherwise shaped by uncertainty, anchoring human experience to a recurring pattern that carried sacred significance. This shift from ritual to tradition also affected the emotional landscape of participants and spectators. Where early gatherings may have been tinged with anxiety, uncertainty, and devotion, later cycles carried confidence tempered by memory. People understood what to expect, and this understanding allowed them to focus more fully on the nuances of performance and observation. Emotion became layered. Excitement coexisted with reverence, anticipation with reflection. Even failure and disappointment were framed within this broader temporal and cultural context. Losing was less a personal tragedy than a moment within a continuum of human effort. The codification of expectation also created subtle hierarchies of experience. Elders, by virtue of memory and familiarity, held knowledge that guided interpretation. They knew the stories, the lessons, and the precedents. Young athletes and spectators relied upon this wisdom, shaping their own actions and understanding through guidance rather than instruction alone. In this way, the games became a medium for transmitting culture, morality, and social norms across generations. As tradition solidified, preparation for the games became increasingly sophisticated. Training regimens were refined, informed by observation and accumulated experience. Coaches, mentors, and families passed down techniques that were honed over decades. Success was no longer purely a matter of individual talent. It became a combination of inherited knowledge, disciplined application, and adherence to ritualized preparation. The integration of these elements reinforced the sacred and social dimensions of competition simultaneously. Despite the growing structure, the games retained an element of unpredictability. Outcomes could never be fully controlled. Natural forces, the heat of the sun, uneven terrain, sudden fatigue, played a role, as did chance, timing, and personal temperament. This balance between expectation and uncertainty gave the events enduring tension, even as the form and sequence became familiar. Audiences and participants alike understood that repetition created patterns, but it did not eliminate the human element, the possibility for surprise, or the need for skill, discipline, and judgment. The evolution of the games also mirrored broader societal changes. City-states experienced shifting alliances, political upheaval, and cultural exchange. These changes subtly influenced participation, audience composition, and interpretation of events. The games absorbed these influences while maintaining continuity, demonstrating resilience and adaptability. They became a living institution, capable of reflecting the society that sustained them while preserving core ideals. Generational continuity further reinforced the game's significance. Athletes grew up immersed in the stories of those who had come before. Children imitated older competitors, learning gestures, techniques, and rituals through observation. Families nurtured participation, ensuring that knowledge, skill, and reverence were transmitted from one generation to the next. The games were not only contests but vehicles for education, shaping physical, moral, and cultural development. Memory and repetition also create a sense of comparison across time. Athletes and spectators measure performance against past standards, striving not only to win, but to align with the accomplishment of ancestors. Historical awareness became embedded in the very act of participation. Each cycle of the games was both present and reflective, a simultaneous engagement with current effort and inherited tradition. The rhythm of the games influenced perception of life beyond the sacred ground. People learned patience, endurance, and timing through participation and observation. They understood that effort required cycles of preparation, observation, reflection, and renewal. The lessons of repetition carried into labor, governance, and domestic life. The sacred cycle of the games provided a framework for human activity more broadly, offering a model of discipline, harmony, and temporal awareness. Over time, the games became less spontaneous and more ceremonial. Rules, expectations, and conduct were formalized. Yet this formalization did not diminish their vitality. Instead, it allowed for a deeper engagement with meaning. The sacred purpose persisted alongside social and political dimensions. Athletes, spectators, and leaders alike navigated layers of interpretation, understanding that each performance was part of an ongoing story larger than any individual life. Even as the games aged, they retained their spiritual resonance. The sacred ground continued to exert quiet authority, demanding respect for ritual, preparation, and conduct. The rhythm of the games tied communities to a temporal and moral framework that transcended fleeting events. Continuity was enforced not only through custom but through collective memory, ensuring that each repetition strengthened connection to the past. By defining cycles, creating expectation, and embedding meaning into repetition, the games became a cultural backbone. They provided structure in an uncertain world, offered lessons in discipline and honor, and facilitated continuity of knowledge, belief, and identity. Through the careful accumulation of ritual and tradition, the games evolved from temporary gatherings into enduring institutions, shaping the consciousness of all who participated or witnessed them. Ultimately, the transformation from ritual to tradition illustrates the human need to anchor experience in repetition and memory. The games were no longer solely events. They were frameworks for understanding time, identity, and morality. Each cycle reaffirmed values, linked generations, and reinforced a sacred rhythm that had guided the earliest participants. In this evolution, the games became not only contests of the body, but ceremonies of continuity, embedding the ephemeral efforts of the present into the lasting fabric of human culture. As the centuries unfolded, the ancient Olympic Games, once intimate gatherings deeply rooted in ritual and local devotion, began to encounter influences from the wider world. Greece was not isolated. It existed within a network of cultures, trade routes, and political exchanges. Travelers, merchants, and envoys brought ideas, customs, and innovations that subtly reshaped how the games were experienced, understood, and valued. While the sacred core remained, the intrusion of foreign influence introduced change that, over time, would alter the character of the competitions themselves. At first, these influences were delicate, almost imperceptible. Visitors from neighboring regions might observe the games, offering small gifts, learning techniques, or participating in ritual in minor ways. Their presence was tolerated and even welcomed, for hospitality was itself a valued custom. Exposure to new methods of training, different styles of competition, and unfamiliar interpretations of ritual enriched local understanding. Some innovations enhanced performance, while others challenged established norms. This exchange was subtle, and the traditionalists watched carefully, balancing curiosity with caution. Gradually, the changes became more pronounced. Wealthier city-states began sponsoring athletes not just to honor the gods, but to demonstrate dominance and sophistication. Training methods borrowed from foreign lands introduced new expectations for strength, speed, and skill. Rituals were modified to accommodate new participants, and the original rhythms of the game shifted in response. What had been familiar and predictable began to feel layered, complex, and occasionally discordant. The influx of foreign athletes presented both opportunity and tension. Participation was broadened, but inclusion became complicated. City-states prized their own representatives, and victory by outsiders could be interpreted as a threat to local prestige. Spectators adjusted their focus, often comparing performance not only against past champions from their own communities, but also against unfamiliar competitors. This comparison altered the emotional landscape, infusing pride and rivalry with new dimensions. Traditional expectations of conduct and discipline were sometimes challenged, provoking debate over what constituted honorable competition. Cultural exchange also affected ceremonial aspects. Foreign visitors might introduce variations in offerings, timing, or ritual gestures. While minor adjustments could be absorbed, more significant deviations sometimes threatened the continuity of tradition. Priests and elders were tasked with interpreting whether new practices were acceptable or if they disrupted the sacred balance. This mediation became increasingly complex as the games grew in fame and scope. The introduction of wealth and influence from foreign sources intensified competition in subtle ways. Training became more specialized and preparation more rigorous. Athletes were expected to perform at higher levels, with increasing pressure to embody both personal excellence and city-state pride. The emphasis on spectacle and demonstration grew. Even within the sacred framework, the games were no longer solely about ritual devotion or physical discipline. They had become arenas in which social, political, and cultural capital were contested. This shift altered the audience experience as well. Spectators were exposed to unfamiliar styles of performance, different approaches to strategy, and even variations in attire or equipment. The visual and emotional texture of the games expanded, creating richer, more complex experiences, but also challenging traditional expectations. Older attendees might feel nostalgia for simplicity, while younger generations embraced novelty. The tension between preservation and adaptation became a defining feature of the gatherings. Foreign influence also affected interpretation of outcomes. Victories were now read not only in spiritual or communal terms, but through broader lenses of prestige and reputation. When an outsider triumphed, it could provoke admiration, resentment, or reflection on the relative strength of city-states. Success became both a personal and political statement, and the moral weight of honor intertwined with social calculation. The audience and athletes alike navigated this new landscape, understanding that performance carried layered significance. At the same time, these external pressures did not entirely erode the sacred dimension of the games. Ritual, prayer, and sacrifice continued to anchor the events, even as human ambition expanded. Priests maintained authority, ensuring that the presence of foreigners' wealth and influence did not wholly overwhelm the foundational purpose. These mediators served as guardians, balancing innovation with tradition, novelty with continuity. Their vigilance preserved the sacred essence, even as the games adapted to changing circumstances. Yet the very presence of foreign influence signaled transformation. Local customs were reshaped by comparison and adaptation. Practices that had once been unquestioned were reconsidered, either refined or replaced. The games became a living reflection of cross-cultural interaction, illustrating how traditions evolve under sustained exposure to new ideas. The sacred rituals persisted, but their expression became more fluid, responsive, and complex. The influx of wealth accompanying foreign influence introduced additional challenges. Athletes who trained with enhanced resources had advantages unavailable to local competitors. This imbalance prompted both admiration and concern. Communities were forced to negotiate the tension between inclusion and equity, tradition and progress. Moral and practical questions emerged. Should all competitors have access to the same advantages? Did material enhancement compromise the spiritual purity of effort? These questions were never fully resolved, but they shaped ongoing discourse and practice. Foreign cultural impact also reached the aesthetic dimension of the games. Attire, gestures, and forms of display sometimes reflected distant customs, subtly altering visual expectations. Music, chants, and other forms of accompaniment occasionally integrated unfamiliar elements, creating hybrid experiences. This blending could excite, inspire, or provoke discomfort, depending on perspective. The games thus became an evolving spectacle where innovation coexisted uneasily with preservation. Political ramifications emerged as well. City-states with access to foreign allies, resources, or methods could exert greater influence. Victory became more than a personal or local achievement. It reflected alliances, trade networks, and shared knowledge. Successes were interpreted through multiple lenses, including spiritual approval, communal pride, and geopolitical strength. The games, in this sense, were a mirror of broader society, revealing the interplay between local tradition and external connection. Even as foreign influence reshaped participation, preparation, and perception, the core experience of the games remained rooted in human effort and devotion. Athletes continued to endure pain, push boundaries, and engage in discipline that transcended external enhancements. The sacred ground retained its authority, the rituals its gravity. This coexistence of change and continuity defined the resilience of the games. Over time, the game's adaptation to outside influence demonstrated the flexibility of tradition. Sacred rituals accommodated new participants, new practices, and new pressures, yet they maintained their essential purpose. The balance between continuity and transformation ensured that the games remained relevant and meaningful, even as they responded to external cultural currents. Ultimately, foreign influence enriched the games while simultaneously challenging them. It introduced complexity, heightened stakes, and expanded the horizon of experience. Athletes, spectators, and leaders were forced to navigate evolving norms, interpret outcomes within broader contexts, and reconcile the sacred with the worldly. The games became a dynamic institution, capable of absorbing external pressures while preserving core values. In this way, the interaction with foreign cultures was not merely superficial. It affected every layer of the games, from preparation and ritual to perception and memory. The introduction of new methods, ideas, and influences reshaped understanding, created tension, and ultimately strengthened the adaptability of the tradition. By integrating foreign impact without surrendering its sacred essence, the games endured as living ceremonies, capable of reflecting both continuity and change, stability and evolution. The experience of the games in this period illustrates a profound truth about human tradition. Endurance does not require isolation. It requires responsiveness, careful judgment, and the ability to integrate novelty without losing essence. The games became a crucible for this principle, demonstrating that sacred ritual, human endeavor, and cultural exchange could coexist, producing a legacy that was at once ancient and continually renewed. Over the centuries, the ancient Olympic Games had evolved in ways no one could have anticipated. What began as intimate gatherings rooted in devotion, ritual, and local identity had become sprawling festivals, drawing participants and spectators from across the Greek world and beyond. They carried layers of history, expectation, and competition, their sacred spaces alive with memory and presence. Yet as the games grew older, subtle shifts began to emerge. Changes that were not abrupt or dramatic, but quiet and persistent, like the slow erosion of stone by wind and rain. Faith, once the lifeblood of the contest, began to fade, and with it, the intensity of ritual and the clarity of purpose that had defined the earliest gatherings. For centuries, the games have been inseparable from belief in the gods. Athletes, spectators, and leaders alike understood that every movement, every effort, was observed, judged, and interpreted by forces far beyond human comprehension. Victories were seen as signs of favor, losses as instruction or correction. Sacrifices, offerings, and prayers punctuated preparation and performance. Even in moments of intense competition, participants were conscious of alignment with divine will. This awareness shaped behavior, ethics, and emotional engagement. It grounded the games in a moral and spiritual framework that extended beyond mere human rivalry. But over time, the clarity of this framework began to blur. Changes in culture, politics, and philosophy shifted perspectives. As city-states rose and fell, as foreign influences permeated Greek society, and as new philosophies and interpretations of the world gained popularity, the absolute authority of the gods began to feel less immediate. What had once been perceived as divine sanction now started to be seen by some as tradition or custom, rather than unquestionable moral truth. Rituals continued, but often more out of habit than conviction. Offerings were made, sacrifices performed, but the sense that the gods were actively watching and influencing outcomes began to fade. The subtle loss of faith had profound consequences. Where devotion had once demanded discipline, humility, and careful conduct, routine began to creep in. Athletes trained because it was expected, not because they felt the need to honor unseen powers. Spectators attended because of entertainment or civic pride, rather than reverence. The sacred weight that had lent the games their depth and intensity slowly eroded, replaced by a sense of mechanical repetition. Participation persisted, but the internal meaning that had motivated it, the fear, hope, and anticipation connected to divine observation, diminished. The fading of faith also altered the emotional landscape. Early generations had approached the games with a mixture of awe and fear. The very act of standing on the sacred ground carried responsibility. Athletes felt the presence of the divine in every muscle, every breath, every strained step. Spectators watched with quiet attentiveness, understanding that misbehavior or negligence could invite not only human shame, but divine displeasure. That tension lent the event's intensity and gravitas, a sense that nothing was trivial. Without that belief, the emotional stakes subtly shifted. Effort still mattered, but the moral and spiritual weight that had once accompanied it weakened. Victory became more about personal or civic pride, less about fulfilling sacred duty. This shift affected the structure of the games themselves. Rituals, once precise and deliberate, began to be observed perfunctorily. Sacrifices were performed, but attention drifted. Offerings might be delayed or improvised. Moment of silence, once filled with reverent focus, became gaps of idle chatter or casual observation. Even the language used by priests and elders reflected this change, becoming more ceremonial than interpretive. The sacred dimension that had shaped judgment, conduct, and preparation became increasingly symbolic rather than immediate or compelling. The consequences extended to athletes' behavior. Where once restraint, humility, and decorum were inseparable from performance, these qualities became negotiable. Ambition persisted, but it was less constrained by ethical or spiritual guidance. The desire to win, which had always existed, now competed with diminished oversight. Rivalries intensified in ways that sometimes threatened decorum, and the moral framework that had mediated competition weakened. Athletes pushed harder, but without the same moral compass that had guided earlier generations. Spectators, too, felt the change. Where crowds had once been attentive, quiet, and reflective, they now became more boisterous, more focused on spectacle than significance. Their attention shifted toward personal enjoyment, curiosity, and civic rivalry. Applause, cheering, and celebration increased in volume and frequency, but the reverent undertone that had marked early gatherings diminished. The experience of observing the games shifted from meditation on human effort in harmony with divine order to appreciation of physical skill and entertainment. Political dimensions became more pronounced in the absence of strong religious focus. Leaders leveraged the games to assert power, display wealth, and manipulate perception. Sponsorship of athletes, financing of infrastructure, and ceremonial presence grew in importance. Where spiritual devotion had once united communities around a shared moral framework, civic pride and rivalry increasingly dictated behavior. Victories were celebrated for their immediate social or political advantage, rather than as manifestations of divine favor. Success and failure were interpreted through human lenses, reducing the sense of moral accountability that had once guided conduct. Philosophical trends contributed to the transformation as well. As rationalist thinking, skepticism, and human-centered ethics gained prominence, the role of divine oversight was questioned or reinterpreted. The gods became distant symbolic or allegorical figures rather than active arbiters of fate. For athletes and spectators alike, this shift created both freedom and uncertainty. Effort was still meaningful, but the moral and spiritual framework that had contextualized it was no longer universal. Some embraced a change, appreciating the games for their athletic, civic, or cultural significance. Others mourned the loss of sacred intensity, sensing a void where once awe and fear had coexisted. The fading of faith also had practical implications for the structure of the games. Oversight of conduct, once reinforced by fear of divine punishment, required human enforcement. Rules and judges assumed greater importance, substituting legal or social consequences for spiritual ones. Punishments for cheating, misconduct, or improper behavior remained, but they now function as civic instruments rather than as reflections of cosmic balance. Honor persisted, but it became more contingent on public perception than moral alignment. As the sacred energy of the games waned, the rituals themselves began to accumulate inertia. Traditions continued because they were embedded in habit, memory, and social expectation, rather than because they were felt as morally or spiritually necessary. The acts of sacrifice, procession, and ceremonial preparation persisted, but their force diminished. The repetition of gestures preserved continuity, yet the original intent behind them, the alignment with divine will, was diluted. This fading of spiritual intensity influenced preparation and training. Athletes continued to practice rigorously, but their motivation shifted increasingly towards civic pride, personal glory, and social recognition. Physical mastery remained essential, but moral and ethical cultivation, once inseparable from preparation, became secondary. The body was trained, but the spirit was less carefully attended. Mental discipline persisted, but it was directed more toward performance than reverence. Over time, this change altered the collective memory of the games. Stories of heroic piety, moral alignment, and divine favor became less central. By the time the final Olympic Games quietly unfolded, the world around them had shifted profoundly. The city-states that had once convened in ritualized harmony had experienced centuries of change, upheaval, and decay. Political structures had risen and fallen, alliances had shifted, and the cultural fabric of Greece itself had been transformed by external influence and internal evolution. The sacred truce, once a fragile promise observed with reverence, now persisted mostly as tradition rather than lived reality. Attendance had dwindled in some areas, grown in others, and the intensity of belief that had once imbued every contest had largely faded. The games persisted, yes, but their resonance was quieter, less immediate, and more symbolic than it had ever been in the earliest gatherings. The final games did not announce themselves dramatically. There were no proclamations, no grand statements that these would be the last. People arrived as they always had, carrying their offerings, tending to rituals, preparing to compete. Athletes warmed their muscles and focused their minds, unaware that they were participating in what history would later recognize as a concluding chapter of a centuries-long tradition. Spectators assembled in the familiar places, tents and shelters erected as before, vendors distributing food and drink, children playing and mimicking athletic movements with innocent enthusiasm. Life at the gathering seemed ordinary, even timeless, but beneath that familiar rhythm lay the subtle undercurrent of an ending no one yet perceived. The rituals continued, though their intensity had diminished. Priests and caretakers oversaw the ceremonies, ensuring that offerings were made and minor rites observed, but the sense that the gods were actively watching had faded. The sacred fires burned, but they carried the weight of tradition more than immediacy. Athletes performed their prayers and gestures, but many did so out of habit, out of respect for continuity rather than genuine expectation of divine favor. The sense of awe and reverence that had once marked every moment was present only faintly, like the echo of a voice in a long, empty hall. Yet even in this diminished form, the rituals provided structure, framing the competitions and connecting participants with the centuries of history that had preceded them. Athletic contests proceeded as always, yet there was a subtle shift in perception. The spectators observed skill and endurance with admiration, but without the same moral or spiritual weight. Victory was acknowledged and celebrated, but it was increasingly interpreted through human, rather than divine, lenses. Pride in personal achievement or civic representation overshadowed the sacred context. Failure, too, was observed without the sense of moral reflection that had once accompanied it. Athletes gave their best, but the sense of cosmic consequence had largely evaporated, leaving contests that were technically the same as before but emotionally and spiritually altered. The dynamics among competitors were also subtly different. Where once restraint, humility, and decorum had been inseparable from preparation and performance, these qualities were now more variable. Some athletes maintained disciplined comportment, honoring the legacy of the games and the expectations of tradition. Others competed with a focus on personal advantage, prestige, or reputation, reflecting the broader social and political currents that had infiltrated the games over time. The mixture of motivations created a complex emotional landscape, a tapestry of commitment, ambition, and ritual that was more human and less absolute than in the earliest eras. Spectators, too, reflected this evolution. Their attention was divided between admiration for skill, curiosity about outcomes, and engagement with the social drama of the gathering. Alliances between city-states, rivalries, and the presence of visiting dignitaries shaped reactions. Applause, cheers, and murmurs were no longer purely expressions of reverence or communal recognition. They had become tools for social signaling, ways to affirm alliances, express pride, or register disapproval. Yet even in this more pragmatic context, the games retained their capacity to inspire, to provide a communal experience, and to create memory. The physical space of the games, once charged with divine presence and ritual significance, now bore witness to centuries of use and adaptation. The sacred ground had endured countless cycles of activity, worn paths etched into the earth, areas trampled by generations of competitors and spectators alike. Yet in its familiarity, there was also a quiet fragility. Structures built for convenience had begun to decay. Stones placed to mark boundaries or honor past champions had weathered with time. The earth retained memory, but the vibrancy of immediate sacred energy had dulled. The landscape itself seemed to anticipate closure, subtly different in texture, in light, in sound from the vibrant eras of earlier centuries. Even the game's infrastructure reflected a blend of tradition and adaptation. Even after the final Olympic Games concluded, the legacy of their history reverberated through centuries, shaping the world in ways that transcended the events themselves. The end of the games marked not simply the cessation of athletic competition, but the culmination of a complex cultural, spiritual, and social institution that had persisted for over a millennium. While the sacred rituals no longer resonated with immediacy, the stories, ideals, and memory of the games carried forward, influencing thought, culture, and identity across generations. The lessons embedded in these events persisted, not through physical repetition, but through narrative, symbolism, and the enduring human fascination with effort, honor, and the pursuit of excellence. The cessation of the games did not erase their memory. Instead, it transformed it. In the absence of active practice, the games existed primarily through oral tradition, inscriptions, and accounts preserved by historians, poets, and philosophers. These narratives became repositories of cultural knowledge, transmitting not only the details of athletic contests, but the ethical, social, and spiritual frameworks that had once guided participation. Victories and defeats, feats of endurance and skill, acts of courage and humility, and even instances of cheating were remembered and retold, creating a tapestry of human behavior that served both as moral instruction and cultural identity. Storytelling became the primary vehicle through which the games endured. Families, communities, and city-states passed down accounts of heroic athletes who embodied discipline and virtue. Elders recounted the efforts of competitors who overcame immense physical challenges, highlighting not only their triumphs, but also the perseverance required to endure pain, fatigue, and uncertainty. Through these narratives, new generations absorbed lessons about the value of preparation, resilience, and integrity. Even as the sacred intensity of the games faded, the moral and cultural dimensions persisted in story, linking successive generations to the original ideals. The stories of athletes also served as vehicles for reflection on human limits and potential. Narratives emphasize the tension between capability and aspiration, illustrating how individuals could stretch their bodies and minds to achieve remarkable feats. Readers and listeners were invited to imagine the strain of running across uneven terrain, the precise timing required in wrestling, or the control power necessary to throw a javelin or discus. Through these stories, human achievement was rendered tangible, even when separated by centuries, and the games became a lens through which people could understand effort, discipline, and the pursuit of excellence as enduring human concerns. Memory of the games extended beyond individual achievement to encompass civic identity and social cohesion. City-states that had historically contributed athletes and resources to the games retained pride in their participation long after the event ceased. Victories were accounted as symbols of communal strength, discipline, and ingenuity. Defeats were remembered as lessons in humility and perseverance. The collective memory of participation reinforced a sense of identity and continuity, linking communities to the broader Greek cultural heritage and providing a touchstone for civic pride and shared values. The cessation of the games also underscored the fragility of human institutions. Despite their centuries-long endurance, the games were ultimately subject to the forces of political change, social evolution, and shifting belief systems. Wars, invasions, and cultural transformations eroded the structures that had supported the games, and religious shifts diminished the intensity of devotion that had been central to their character. Yet this very fragility highlighted the adaptability of tradition. While the physical events ceased, the ideals they embodied, discipline, honor, skill, and communal participation, continued to shape society, demonstrating that cultural influence does not depend solely on active practice. Philosophers and historians of later periods engaged deeply with the memory of the games, interpreting them as more than athletic contests. They examined the ethical frameworks embedded in preparation, competition, and conduct. They reflected on the balance between personal ambition and communal responsibility, the tension between competition and cooperation, and the role of ritual and ceremony in shaping human behavior. Through these analyses, the games became object of intellectual inquiry, providing insight into human nature, social organization, and the interplay between culture, morality, and performance. The game's legacy was thus preserved not only in narrative but in critical reflection, offering enduring lessons about the integration of physical, ethical, and social dimensions of life. The material traces of the games also contributed to their lasting impact. Ruins of stadiums, pathways worn by generations of athletes, and inscriptions commemorating victories or notable events provided tangible links to the past. Archaeological remnants allowed later societies to visualize and reconstruct the games, deepening understanding and sustaining cultural memory. These physical markers, combined with narratives and historical analysis, ensure that the games remain present in the cultural imagination, even when no new competitions were held. Artistic representation played a significant role in preserving the memory and ideals of the games. Sculptures, paintings, pottery, and other forms of visual culture captured athletes' emotion, emphasizing their physical prowess, poise, and discipline. These representations often idealize the human body, celebrating both strength and grace, and reinforce the moral and aesthetic dimensions of competition. Through art, the games transcended their immediate context, offering enduring examples of the integration of physical excellence, beauty, and cultural significance. The symbolic dimension of the games continued to evolve after their cessation. As the centuries passed, the story of the ancient Olympic Games became a cornerstone of Western cultural memory, providing lessons not only about physical achievement, but also about the human spirit and the values that bind communities together. Even after the Games had ended, their influence rippled through the ages, shaping both the society that had created them and the generations that followed. What had once been a series of athletic contests dedicated to honoring the gods had grown into something far more profound, a cultural institution that transcended time, embodying ideals of discipline, excellence, unity, and respect for tradition. Its story became a mirror, reflecting the aspirations and struggles of humanity, echoing the eternal tension between the pursuit of personal glory and the collective good. The Games, in their final moments, offered no dramatic exit. There were no declarations or ceremonies marking their end, no grand closure. The very nature of their conclusion was as quiet and subtle as their beginning. In a sense, the end was always implicit in their design. The cycles of the Games were rooted in the recognition of human mortality, of the limits of the body, and the passage of time. Yet their cessation left behind a legacy that proved to be far from ephemeral. The memory of the Games continued to influence philosophy, art, politics, and even the way that people thought about themselves and their place in the world. The Games have become a foundational myth, a touchstone for reflection on the human condition, and the meaning of competition, striving, and community. One of the central aspects of the Games' enduring legacy was the notion of personal effort as a reflection of moral character. In the early days of the Games, athletes competed not merely for the sake of victory, but as a form of devotion to the gods, to their city-state, and to themselves. Success was seen as a manifestation of divine favor, reward for the athlete's dedication, discipline, and moral integrity. Losing, on the other hand, was viewed as an opportunity for reflection and improvement, a chance to reassess one's efforts and come back stronger. The ideals of honor, humility, and perseverance were as essential to victory as physical prowess itself. Over time, these values became ingrained not only in athletic competition, but in broader social and cultural norms. As the Games transitioned from their religious origins to a more secular and political arena, these ideals continued to shape Western civilization. The Olympics were no longer just a reflection of divine will. They became a symbol of human achievement, representing the highest ideals of personal and civic responsibility. The story of the Games, as passed down through generations, became a model for personal and collective aspiration. Athletes who excelled in the ancient Games were not merely celebrated for their physical feats, but for their embodiment of the virtues that Greek society held dear: courage, endurance, strength, and above all, a sense of duty to the greater good. The Games also fostered a sense of unity that transcended the individual. In the early Games, athletes were not competing solely for personal glory, but for the honor of their city-state. Success on the field was seen as a reflection of the strength, discipline, and unity of the community. This sense of shared purpose, of individual effort contributing to the greater whole, was central to the Games' role in Greek society. In a world divided by city-states and prone to political turmoil, the Olympic Games were a rare occasion for unity. This collective spirit was reinforced by the sacred truce, which temporarily suspended conflicts between warring states, allowing athletes and spectators to come together in a shared celebration of human achievement. Even as the Games became more politically charged, the underlying idea of collective identity remained. Athletes, spectators, and political leaders all understood that the Games were a means of showcasing the strength and values of their respective communities. Yet this sense of competition did not breed division alone. It also fostered a sense of shared cultural pride that transcended individual rivalry. The ancient Olympics, at their core, were an acknowledgement of the shared humanity of all participants, whether they were from a rival city-state or an ally. Even as political and military allegiances shifted, the Games remained a symbol of a common cultural heritage, one that celebrated human achievement in its highest form. The influence of the Games extended far beyond the athletic arena. Over time, the Olympics came to represent not just physical competition, but the Greek ideal of the well-rounded individual, someone who combined intellectual achievement, physical strength, and moral virtue. This concept of the ideal citizen was a powerful influence on Western thought. Philosophers, playwrights, and political theorists in Greece and Rome sought to incorporate the values embodied in the Games into their broader ideas about society, virtue, and the human condition. The Games, with their emphasis on effort, discipline, and excellence, became a model for personal and civic ideals, informing ideas about education, governance, and the role of the individual within the community. The legacy of the Olympic Games was also reflected in the visual arts. Sculptors, painters, and other artists frequently depicted athletic competitions, capturing the beauty and intensity of the human body in motion. The ancient Greeks, in particular, were fascinated by the human form and saw in the athlete's body a symbol of ideal beauty, strength, and grace. Statues of victorious athletes, many of which still survive today, became symbols of human potential and achievement. The idealization of the athlete's body in art served as a reminder of the power and beauty of human effort, reinforcing the cultural importance of physical competition and the virtues it embodied. The Olympics, through their representation in art, became more than just a series of games. They were a celebration of humanity's capacity for greatness.